Matches the chairs. Good morning. So I am currently in Atlanta, Georgia. Born and raised in Beaumont, Texas. Any of you ever been to Beaumont? So you could say I have deep Southern roots, and occasionally you'll hear me say y'all, and in plural it's all y'all. So I bring all y'all greetings from the southern part of Atlanta, and it's a pleasure to be here. And like Reverend Cynthia was saying, Roland and I have been friends, and it's been wonderful to connect with Reverend Cynthia. And I just wanted to be able to offer and give something back to the degree that they've been giving me something back. And I was not raised in a metaphysical or a new thought environment. Probably like a lot of you in this room, I was raised in a more traditional religious background. In fact, in Beaumont, Texas, my whole family grew up in what was called First Assemblies of God. Anybody know that? Praise God, hallelujah. So, and it wasn't until I was a teenager that I really began to listen to the message. And something wasn't resonating for me. The whole idea of not being good enough, and the whole idea of always scrambling to get approval from this idea of God just wasn't hitting the target for me, and yet I didn't know anything different than that. And I was willing to take my chances. And I knew that all that I could do in order to separate from that and go on my own path of exploration was to get a scholarship. And I came from little means, and my mother was a widow, and so I knew that if that was going to happen, I had to be intentional about that. And I was so grateful when I got a journalism scholarship to North Texas State. And I remember the day the letter came in the mail, and I remember just picturing in my mind her turning cartwheels, because I would have been the only child out of a large group of siblings that would be going to university. And when she came home from work that day and I rolled out that, I was just waiting, and she was stone-faced, and she just stood there. And I was like, what? And after a long pause, she said, son, the Lord told me. Now, if your mom starts a sentence with the Lord told me, there's probably going to be little room for argument. And she said that the Lord had told her that I was supposed to go to Oral Roberts University. Now, I had grown up, again, in a particular religion, and for me, as a graduating senior from high school, it felt like, oh my God, 4 more years of the same thing. No, I can't take it. So very quickly, in my mind, I created a deal, and I said, look, I'll tell you what, I will go if I apply and I get a scholarship there. Because really, there was no way to make that happen. And I just knew, because it was June and the academic year started in August, that there would be no scholarships left, right? That's pretty clear-headed thinking. And I was very confident. And I applied, and I purposefully waited till the last moment to send the application in. And wouldn't you know, there was one scholarship left. And this will teach you to be specific, because it was not a full scholarship, it was a half scholarship. So not only did I have to fulfill my agreement with my mother, but I also had to work full-time in order to pay for all of that. And off I went into the same message, into the same environment. Again, wasn't anything different than how I had been raised, but in New Thought, there is this wonderful phrase called divine discontent. Divine discontent is an amazing thing. In fact, when it happens for you, we should learn to celebrate it, because it means we're at the precipice of outgrowing something. And in order to grow, we have to outgrow. In order to be available to whatever is next expansively within us, be it physical, spiritual, or emotional, we have to be willing to outgrow or let go of the old paradigm. And so for me, I was in divine discontent. And 4 more years of that just seemed unbearable to me. But in my freshman year, craftily thinking how I was going to pay for all of this, there was a sign in the student union building. And it was advertising for these music groups. And it said if you auditioned and you got in one, you would tour a particular portion of the United States and you would get scholarship money. And I was like, oh, scholarship money. So I auditioned as a freshman, and lo and behold, if I didn't get in one of those groups, and lo and behold, if I didn't tour the South in the summertime in a hot van, but the person who was in charge of that was a very talented musician, a very talented leader, and I remember being enamored and in awe of his talent. And I said, okay, if he's going to be here, if I can work in this program, I can survive this. And of course, he left right after that summer. And again, the divine discontent is just bubbling up. And but I realized something, that in order to move away or to transfer, I would have to basically start all over again. So, I held out, and by the time I was graduating, I took that diploma and I made this particular affirmation. I never want to have anything to do with God ever again. Because divine discontent was spouting out of my head like Old Faithful. And off I went with all my little savings, and I moved to New York City, and I was going to be an actor, and I put blinders on, and that's what my focus was on, and that's what I worked towards, and stayed faithful to that. And even a few years after that, went to Los Angeles and was still pursuing that path. And about my second week in Los Angeles, I run into somebody, literally physically run into somebody on famous Melrose Avenue. And we're looking at each other, and I went, oh my God, that's the guy from Oral Roberts that had been in charge of that music program. And he looked at me and he said, what are you doing here? And I explained to him, and immediately, he invited me to a meeting on Wednesday night. Now, if you came from that background, what would you think that he's inviting you to? Church. And what was my affirmation? I want nothing to do with God ever again. So I'm making excuses off of the top of my head as fast as I can. And he starts to laugh, and he goes, no, this is different. This is different. There's this really amazing woman, and she's just getting started, and I think you would actually enjoy what it is that she has to say. I find it really, really empowering. And she has this meeting every Wednesday night. And he was very persuasive, so I said, okay. So I went, and I sat, and do you recall the first time that you ever heard something different than how you perhaps had been domesticated or indoctrinated? Something different, and that something different resonated for you? Well, that was that night. And it was really amazing, because this woman was standing up in front of this small crowd and saying, who you are in this moment is enough. There's nothing that you have to do in order to earn your value. Really, all that is required is for each of us individually to recognize that, and then to make choices that are healthy and loving, and to move in that particular direction. And I'm like, what? And so I checked the room, and I thought, am I in a group of alien sea pods here? What's happening? And everybody was sort of nodding and in agreement, and it was so amazing. It was like the beginning of this paradigm shift. And afterwards, my friend came up to me, and he goes, what'd you think? And I went, that was pretty cool. And he goes, well, she wants music to go along with her message, and she hasn't really been able to find anything, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in collaborating in that particular effort. Because he was running sound, and he was in charge of the whole dynamic of the evening, and I said, sure. Because at that point, I didn't know very many people in L.A. And so that began this long journey, this long, amazing, fulfilling journey into this whole new thought, metaphysical, spiritual life. And that woman was Louise Hay. And I don't know if you're familiar with Louise Hay or not, but I got to travel with Louise in the very beginning for several years, and we were the music for her, and she became like a second mom to me and remained that way until just a couple of months ago when she made her transition at 90 years old. And a few weeks I was in San Diego, and there were a few of us that created a wonderful ceremony. And she didn't want a big thing, but to look at how her intention, and the way in which my path crossed with hers literally changed the entire focus of my life. And so she taught me a lot. She taught me about honoring the entirety of my journey. There would be times when we were traveling on the road, and this was before the days of cell phones, and when you were an aspiring actor, you had to call your answering service, or you had to call your agent and go, did I get a call back? Did they like me? Did they want it? And every time we'd be on the road, I'd have to tell them to pull the van over. And the whole joke was, David has to call his agent. And I remember one significant night, I was up for something really, really big, and they pulled the van over, and I called, and I didn't get it. And I stormed back into the van, and I just sat there in a huff right next to Louise, and I'm breathing really heavy. And I want everybody to say, what's wrong? And nobody said anything. And finally, Louise just patted me on my knee, and she said, she always called me son, you're going to have to remember, you're going to have to honor the entirety of the journey. Even in this, there is something good. And I started this long diatribe. Oh, if only this had been different. If this had been different, I would have gotten this job. And she said, no, even what's happening now is working for your highest good. And that was the amazing thing about Louise Hay, is that she never changed her message, even for a special occasion. You ever heard that phrase before? I'm spiritual, but when there's a special occasion, I set my spirituality down and I go unconscious. No, it's a mainstay. It's a constancy. And over these years, as I've begun to look at and follow my own path, as I became so invested in my own growth and interested in the classwork and in all of the things that would help in my spiritual practice, I ended up aligning with the Centers for Spiritual Living, which is a sister movement of unity, and I ended up becoming a minister and getting my master's degree in theology, and my whole life just did a complete 180. And over the years, as I've looked at this path, the commonality that continues to exist is people want to know, how do I get from here, where I am, to here, which is what my heart's desire is. Tell me how to do that. And often we can intellectualize that and we can go through the motions, but I've learned that there's a difference than being interested in something and being invested in something. And I've always wanted to know, what's the tipping point for people? How do we go from being interested in self-improvement? How do we go from being interested in wanting to be more loving into being invested? Because what's the difference in that? Action, right? Embodiment. There's a massive difference between those two dynamics. And to become invested in something means that it has value for you and I. Have you ever realized that we're walking around as these energetic beings, and we have what I call a hierarchy of value? Hierarchy of value simply means that the things that are of most value to you is what you spend your time with, what you spend your money on, what you talk about the most. It's the social circle that you hang out with. It's everything that you give yourself over to. That's a representation of your values. And it's fascinating because if you start to look at life as a value path, you can pretty much tell just in brief conversations what someone values. So for example, there are people, and you know them, there are people who value chaos. Chaos is in their value system. And even when chaos doesn't exist, what will they do? They will find a way to create it. Or they will move into a situation that's chaotic. Or they will align themselves with that kind of situation. I once knew this woman that I was working with in a coaching program. And her struggle, again, always financial. But in her value system, this is amazing. In her value system were shoes. Shoes. She loved shoes. And because it was in her value system, it was in the top, she wanted that. People would give her shoes. She would be in situations where she would date someone who would buy her shoes. And it didn't matter where she was economically, new shoes would cross her path. Because it's what she obsessed over. It's what she thought about. It's what her focus was. It's what she was invested in. And I want to talk to you about this morning because I run into so many folks that when I go up to them and I say, tell me what your values are, they can't really speak them. And I want to offer you the suggestion that the more that we become invested and clear about what our values are, the more our life begins to magnetize those things. When you become clear about what's important to you, it actually helps you say yes to the things that are more resonant to what your heart's desire is. And here's the kicker, it also helps you say no to the things that don't align with what it is that you're wanting to do. And I think it was Oprah many years ago that said, I never knew what an authentic yes felt like until I learned how to say no. And values will help us do that. It will help us get really crystal clear. And what's important about that level of clarity? Because, again, and every single one of us, regardless of our history, regardless of age, regardless of economic bracket, we're wanting, our heart's desire is wanting to go from here to something else within mind. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, the idea of desire or want is really a part of who we are because we're evolutionary beings. Can you imagine if the caveman didn't want or desire something different? Then our situation might be very primitive. Can you imagine? No HBO. And so, because there's always been this evolutionary process, what could it be in order for us to honor that? And so for me, as I began to look at the possibility of that and say honor to that, ever since I was a little child, I was the last, again, of a bunch of children in poor situations. One of my values, without even realizing it, was adventure. Because it was not the most healthy environment that I was raised in. There was a lot of abuse. And I would hide up in trees. Any of you ever climbed trees when you were a kid? I would hide up in trees and I would read books. And when I would read these books in these trees, this escapist part of my mind would go, oh, wow, if I could just do this, if I could just go there. And I remember there was a series for young readers, autobiographies. And I would ride my little rusted bike to the library and remember the baskets? And I remember pleading with the librarian, could I check out more than I'm allotted? And usually she would let me do that. And I would load that basket up with all these autobiographies. And up that tree I would go. And I would read the lives of George Washington Carver or Harriet Tubman or Abner Doubleday, the inventor of baseball, and Walt Disney, and all of these people from all different spans of life. And I found a commonality with them. Everyone had adversity. Every single person. And yet, there was something within them in that adverse situation. Some of them just unseemingly impossible to get out of. They would find a way to move forward. And I would think, if they can do that, so can I. If they can do that, so can I. And this value of adventure, of how do I do that, continue to live inside of me. Fast forward, and we'll cover a lot of this in the workshop this afternoon, but fast forward, I'm an adult, and that value of adventure is still very much there. And I start to look at all the opportunities in the world, and somehow I come across the idea, with some help, of I could take people on trips. I could take people to sacred site journeys, and if I could get enough people to sign up on these trips, I too could see the world. cheap. Cheap was the operative word. Perhaps even get paid for it. And so that happened a lot. And I went to China and Peru and got to see things. And there was one particular trip that was to Thailand and Cambodia. And I had never been to either place. I didn't even know that in Cambodia is the largest spiritual temple complex in the world. It's called Angkor Wat. And it's a blend of both Hindu and Buddhist traditions, but it's this massive thing that you can never see all of it in just one visit. That's how massive these temple arrangements are. And so we were going there, and people signed up. And we went to Thailand, and it was wonderful. But something happened when we got to Cambodia. You ever been to a place and you go, this feels familiar? Or there's just something soul-stirring about a location. That's exactly what happened in Cambodia. This was a long time ago. This was more than 15 years ago. And the planes would land in a very primitive tarmac. It's much different today. And we would be there, and as we were walking in, I could just feel this energy of this place. And I didn't even know at the time, but it had only been 30 years since their own civil war. They had had a civil war where more than 2 million Cambodian people had been slaughtered in a genocide because of an oligarch ruler that was deemed to push them in a different direction. And yet, even in spite of that recent history, there was this beauty and this equanimity among the people. And yet, there was also the delineation between the haves and the have-nots. The haves were tourists, and the have-nots were the local Cambodian people. And as is natural, those who were with me wanted to do something. There was an empathy there, a natural empathy. And I had become accustomed to that, so I went to the guide, and I said, I have 15 captive people who would like to do something, but I have a challenge for you. Take us to where the greatest need is. I said, don't hold back. And he said, why would you want to do that? And I said, because I feel that that would be important. These people are really adamant about wanting to do something. So take us to where the greatest need is. And he told me briefly about the Tonle Sap Lake, which is the largest waterway in that part of Asia. And it's the dry season. And he says, if you go there now, the water recedes so much that all of the refugees and all of the landmine victims, you remember Princess Diana? The last initiative that she worked on was the landmines in Cambodia, because during that civil war, they had planted all these landmines in all these fields across the country. And the last ones that were planted were made out of plastic. And then, all these years later, they were teaching children recycling. So if they're in a field and they see plastic, they go and they pick them up, and then it would blow their limbs off. So you had these, you had orphaned, you had disenfranchised, you had so many of the poorest of the poor congregating on the banks of this lake. And he said, if you really want to go to the worst, it's there. And he said, I'm going to need, though, to get a message to them, and you should feed them, and you can't just feed them anything. You're going to have to feed them something that's indigenous to their particular digestive system. And I said, how do we do that? So he took us to the local markets. If you've ever been to a third world country, you'll notice that all the locals have their sort of food markets. And he took us to this wide place where all these people had their wares and their produce and the things that they had grown or that they were harvesting. And the group decided that we would buy 3 families' markets worth of food, everything they had. It was a good day for them. We came and we said, we want all 3 of these particular markets. We had to get vans in order to put them in. And when I went to pay for it, guess how much it cost? $86 for 3 markets worth of food. And it was in that moment that I remember this old dusty road, and I was like kicking my feet in the sand going, you've got to be kidding me. Even I could create something sustaining. And that idea stuck in my head. And off we went in this caravan with all this food. And somehow he had gotten a message to, even in a transient village, there's a matriarch. And he had gotten a message to the matriarch. And when we were there, when we arrived, there were more than 100 children sitting uniformed in line in this dry cake bed. And it was peaceful and orderly as we began to pass out everything for about 6.5 minutes. And then, off in the distance, hundreds of more children started running towards us because word was out, there was food. And then it turned into chaos. And then, before you knew it, everything was distributed, and we all stood there huffing and breathing really fast, and we looked down, and all of our clothes were covered with these little muddy handprints from all these children grabbing at us. I remember distinctly one woman saying, I'm never going to wash this. This is like the canvas of humanity. And something happened in that moment physiologically within my heart. I go, uh-oh, about to lose. Any of you ever lost it? Some people call it the ugly cry. You ever had the ugly cry? And I'm not real big on doing the ugly cry in front of other people. And I'm standing there and I'm like looking for a place to go. And all that there is this old pontoon boat on the smelly water. And I crawled on my hands and knees into that pontoon boat and I began to sob. And here's the strange thing. It wasn't out of pity. It was this mystical experience where I was connected to these children. I was that child, and that child was me. To put words to it diminishes the feeling. But in that moment, I made a vow. And I said that I would come back. I would come back, and I would find a way to try to create some kind of sustainability for that. And all of a sudden, all of these trips gained a whole new focus. Roland, what was that first slide, the next one. So I found this quote in the 90s, and Doug Boyd was a travel writer. And it said, the most powerful mantra that you can say is, I'm available. And then you got to watch out. Because if you're really sincere, if you really mean it, things happen. And it was about the same time on that Cambodia trip. And I remember leaning down in that pontoon boat saying, I'm available. I'm available. What's beautiful about that is it's not, the how is none of our business. You ever get caught up in the how? Well, how is this going to happen? How am I going to do that? What if the how is none of our business, and our only business is to say, I'm available? And so I did. And it took a long time, many years of going and making a lot of mistakes. But I'm here to tell you that after a long time of going back and figuring out sustainability initiatives and digging wells, that it was during one time when I looked at someone that I was partnering with over there in Cambodia, and I said, how much would it cost to build a school? And he said, why would you want to do that? And I said, why not? And one thing led to another, and again, in 2009, after many years, I finally got approval from the government of Cambodia to open up an NGO school in Siem Reap, Cambodia. It's actually the school that Roland came and volunteered in. Imagine Roland digging trenches to build a sewing facility in order to teach life skills, and that's where I first met Roland. Yeah. And because of that is why I'm here, because I'm very grateful, because Roland's loyalty and support in our initiative has continued to grow. And so some of these next slides then show how something came from nothing. The first time I was there, the next slide, this was the very first day. We didn't have anything to work in. And so we sat on mats in the dirt, and we started our first classes. And those continue to evolve until now. This was our first classroom pavilion that we had there. Today, we have a certificate graduation day. We've graduated hundreds of children in life skills training opportunities and initiatives. We teach them free education, free English. We have an IT tech center, and they're learning how to code. We're really focused on educating girls in order to break the cycle of the poverty and any of the other temptations and the really awful things that can go down if something doesn't disrupt that particular path. We have freshwater well initiatives. Imagine being in a family and you've never had fresh water, and in 24 hours we have a way to tap into that underneath the ground and then give them a better alternative and a healthier lifestyle. And these are some of the other recipients of the wells. And this is the new village school outside of Siem Reap, which is about 14 kilometers away, in a village called Nokokrau. And this was just last January, and look how many, and they were actually, I thought I would teach them meditation. They were teaching me. In fact, one of the little girls up front said, "You're doing it wrong." So, and it was last year when we were there that we looked at each other and we realized that all of these amazing systems were in place. And we decided, what would it look like if we replicated this in other areas? This year, we just opened up a beginning school in India. And let me tell you, that was a handful. And we also began to align with other initiatives in Guatemala. And from that was born this foundation. And let me just tell you, all of that was from a value of sitting in a tree as a kid, of adventure, and learning how to refine that value. So now guess what one of my values is? Global education. That wasn't even on my radar. But because I was faithful to one particular value, it's led and opened up to a whole different lifestyle. So I hope that you will stay and hang around and chat and let me tell you more about this, and let me guide you through an amazing, fun process of how you and I can get clear on our values. And let me teach you how to say, I'm available to that. And like the mantra said, watch out. Watch out. Because if you're sincere, things will begin to happen. And so it is. Thank you so much.